definitely a pleasure having y'all here. Obviously, it's very early, so participation might be lower compared to yesterday. But either way, we can still make it a vibe, still make it cozy, and all that. This is kind of a little bit of a continuation of what we spoke about yesterday. So we spoke mostly about hip hop and social media. Before we even dive into this, for those of y'all that were present, if we could continue that convo a little bit, just to kind of piggyback into this. But what were some of the things that, if you were present yesterday, some of the things that I guess resonated with you throughout the rest of the day after you left the workshop?
One of the things I was thinking about was in trying to use social media and music to connect with the students is doing your own research to know what they're into. So like sometimes my son is talking about something that's on TikTok and I'm like, I look at TikTok but I have no idea what he's talking about just because he's a different age, and so what comes up on his algorithm is completely different. It's not my language. I don't understand it. So that's one of the things that I was thinking about.
Gotcha. That reminds me of the young lady that was here yesterday that she said she teaches English, but she blends it with poetry and rap and stuff like that. After the workshop, she told me that she does an assignment with her whole class where she has everybody, type in specific things to basically mess with their algorithms, and then they all compare at the end of the class like what they all end up seeing. And then some people end up seeing the same thing, like they get the same type of algorithms, recommendations on their YouTube or IG or whatever, Instagram, and then other people get completely different ones, so then they start debating it, talking about it, why they think that is, things of that nature. And that's interesting because people don't really realize one way or another, we're basically being directed, right? It's like somebody's directing traffic, but just invisibly, like behind the scenes. But that's basically what happens with social media with the algorithms. They're directing traffic, and they're basically recommending, but really they're telling us to go this way. And the moment that you type one thing in, the algorithm's already gonna feed it to you and hundreds and thousands and millions of other people at the same time. So that's where you get a lot of people who might be looking at the world the same way or thinking the same way or whatever the case may be. So it was definitely an interesting conversation point that we shared. So I definitely feel you on that. What are some other reflection points y'all may have had from yesterday's convo?
What we're seeing today is no different than what we've seen in the past, really. It's just that the medium has changed. If you look at things like the Birmingham Children's March,
Yeah.
it was young folks who led the movement. And it was the radio station that was calling in literally calling in the control. They were like the control of when folks need to show up, where they need to show up, how they need to show up. So it's very, and you look at, sort of historically how music has influenced every form of social justice, and how folks have used music to make statements.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you have, of course, Bob Marley. That's in part of the reason why his life ended. You know what I'm saying? You have, what's it called? Even back in the day, Bob Dylan did the song Hurricane, where he's talking about the boxer that got. People think that it's just like a nice, because it got kind of like a nice melody to it, but he's talking about a professional boxer who's wrongfully convicted. And there's a lot of songs like that where they kind of give off like a melodic, feel-good type of vibe, but that's only to like reel you in so that you can listen to the actual message eventually. One thing about music is it is the ultimate, I guess, one of the ultimate equalizers. Like music, sports, like it don't matter what background you come from, it don't matter your personal beliefs, political beliefs, anything like that. Once you hear the same song, somehow that transcends all of that, and And that's why I personally believe they pay musicians the amount of money that they do, because it's like you literally can change a person's way of thinking just through that, you know, through the sonic of it, through the sound, the feeling, all of that, because as people, we're very sensitive to vibration. We're very sensitive to frequency, everything. Even, you know, diseases, viruses, those things have frequencies, those things have hertz, right? They can be measured in hertz, frequencies, things like that. So all this stuff, like, even though it's invisible to our eyes, like, they all have an effect on us, they all has an influence on us. So that's why a hip hop artist can get paid millions and millions of dollars, because the amount of influence that person's gonna have, you know. And once a label tells you what to say, pretty much, is like you're the perfect puppet, in other words. So definitely an excellent conversation yesterday. But taking those points and blending it into today, you know, I do want us to go into today's presentation thinking about, of course, how to blend hip hop, you know, music in general, but even social media into your classroom space, and understanding that this is a form of social inclusivity and a way of also being somebody that provides a level of social justice. Because when we think about education, especially higher education, especially if you're dealing with Black, brown students, generally speaking, education wasn't or this system of education wasn't necessarily made for this population, right? And so allowing for education to happen through things that they're already familiar with, music, hip hop, social media, that is being equitable, right? That is a form of meeting them where they're at, because what's happened in society, especially Black, brown communities, the culture gets penalized, right? This is the same thing in criminal justice. I teach criminal justice. You know, you go off a profile, oh, this person looks suspicious. What's suspicious? Oh, they got baggy pants. Well, that's just part of the culture. You know what I'm saying? So you start criminalizing the culture, and it just so happens the person that committed the crime is part of the culture. You know what I'm saying? So it all goes hand in hand. But what I want to get into is kind of talking about how those are ways of, you know, incorporating a form of social justice directly to your students. But I want to talk specifically about how to incorporate just the idea of social justice in general into your classes. So if you teach math, if you teach English, if you teach biology, whatever the case may be, how can we incorporate examples of social issues into those classroom spaces as well? So that's pretty much what the presentation is. So I already introduced myself yesterday, but you know, for those of y'all that weren't here, I'm Professor Cabrera. I teach criminal justice. I also have taught at different colleges in the CUNY system, in Rutgers, Hudson Community College. I used to work in the Department of Corrections in New York, in Rikers Island. Like I said yesterday, whatever you heard about it, it's probably true. And you know, my goal now is just, you know, pass a lot of that information that I learned in the correctional system to the next generation, but also find ways to evolve the education system, because, you know, especially in Black and brown populations, there's not necessarily a lot of representation, and especially amongst young men of color, what have you. So I try to be of impact in there. So what I want to talk about today are pretty much a couple of different aspects. So when we talk about social justice and just teaching in general, there's certain outcomes that we want to focus on, right? So we want to talk about community, we want to talk about the scholarship aspect of it, operationalization, rapport. Then you can have the quote unquote woke dialogue, like, you know, an example of it would be kind of like what we have right now, just like a little snippet of it. Accountability, orientation, mentorship, and legacy. So I'll break all this down in the order and why I picked these things specifically and why they're important. Pretty much the idea of a revolution is just, anytime you've seen a revolution, it usually started with young people. You know, and even before that actual revolution began, like let's say like the Civil Rights Movement or the Black Panther Party or what have you, those leaders started this revolutionary mindset when they was in college, right? When we think about Martin Luther King, when we think of Huey P. Newton, Fred Hampton, you know, a lot of these different individuals, like Fred Hampton got killed when he was 21, right? Huey P., you know, and I have him here as an example because to me he's one of the best examples. He was illiterate according to his book, Revolutionary Suicide, and that's where I got the title for this book. He was illiterate going into college, right? But once they got into this space, which is college, because it's a place of education, but it's a place of, you know, free thinking as well, or at least that's generally what it has been. That's where a lot of individuals can sharpen their minds. They can blend different ideas and then eventually transition that into grassroots activism or what have you. You know what I'm saying? And I'm not saying that the purpose of this is for people to become activists necessarily, but in their own way, through their professions, through their communities, through their families, they practice forms of it, right? But a lot of it has to be established first in the learning environment, which in the case for a lot of these leaders was in the college education space. And then the last thing is the prognosis, which is students are often eager to get involved, but lack the foresight and the guidance. This is where the classroom comes in. As educators, we will discuss different strategies on how to optimize the classroom experience to empower students to engage in criminal justice reform, race-based policies, socioeconomics, and more. So yesterday we talked about the civic square, right? So pretty much we got civic engagement here. The main thing is to understand the importance of having these dialogues with the purpose of civic engagement. So ultimately, these conversations are not being had just to be had, right? We want that once we have these types of conversations, and then you start seeing that the students start, you know, understanding the concepts and the content and what have you, now that becomes transitionable into student government, into joining a nonprofit organization, into doing other things, maybe boosting your resume, you know, because now you understand that through boosting my resume, I can do these other things, right? So there's so many different outlets that we can look at on how the civic engagement looks like, but these are just a couple examples. And then actionable items. We will also explore how educators can get involved in the fight for justice by using personal, professional examples and supporting the students. By the end of the session, our dialogues and activities will lead to the application of these tools in the classroom with confidence. So civic engagement, pretty much this part right here is again just developing the conversation, understanding, and action. It's kind of like yesterday we talked about freedom of association, freedom of assembly, and freedom of expression. Basically, this would be kind of like the just the freedom of association part of it, just the right to associate, right? So here we just want to have the opportunity to just even be able to have the dialogue. So again, yesterday we talked about the George Floyd situation briefly. But again, unfortunately, George Floyd was not the only person who has been victimized by police brutality throughout the years. And these are just some of the main names that people might be familiar with. There's many other names, obviously, that have not made this specific slider overall. And what I want to do right here is just walk you through a couple of, especially as a criminal justice professor, there's a lot of history in the criminal justice system that people are not aware of. And this is, first, it's important for us as educators to understand the lack of justice that exists in this country. A lot of the injustices we see, we have to understand it didn't happen from one day to the next. This is a whole embedded algorithm, if you want to call it that, right? There's a silver line that has been drawn from like hundreds of years ago all the way to today's present current criminal justice system. This is actually from the National Law Enforcement Museum, their website. On the left, you see a slave patrol badge, right? And as you can probably infer, you know, they used to capture runaway slaves at the time. And on the right, you see a sheriff LA County badge. Do you see much of a difference between the two? They're more or less the same, right? And here in the oath sounds very similar to some oaths that we take that public servants take today. I, patroller's name, do swear that I will, at searching for guns, swords, and other weapons among the slaves in my district, faithfully and as privately as I can, discharge the trust reposed in me as the law directs to the best of my ability, so help me God. Right? So, you know, I'm not sure when's the last time we had swords in America, but you know, they might have been watching Yosemite Sam or something like that. But the point of this is that this is an oath And if we listen to the oaths that law enforcement make today, a lot of it is very similar, right? It's not to say that it's the same exact thing, because obviously there has been changes, but when we look at some of the attitudes in law enforcement, especially towards predominantly black communities, but communities of color in general, we can see a lot of the residue from this era of slave patrol catches still kind of showing up in different ways. Just a couple of stats or a couple of things to put out there if we're not already familiar with them. People of color are more likely to have police called on them, being stopped and frisked by police, have physical use of force used on them by police, brutalized, potentially killed by police, even when no weapon is recovered, right? Like, one of the most glaring examples was when Dylan Roof did the whole, the mass shooting, and after the situation, they brought him out with a bulletproof vest and took him to Wendy's because, they were scared that somebody was going to attempt to kill him or something like that. But, in other situations, especially when you're talking about young black males and, people that at the end are found to not even be guilty, they end up not even having the same type of level of sympathy in regards to that, right? And then we're talking about also people of color are more likely to be convicted with stiffer sentences. So the black and the white community, for example, consume drugs at about the same rate. That rate is pretty much about equal across the board, right? But if you're white, you're 3 times less likely to get penalized with stiffer sentences than if you're black. And so these are statistics that are generated by the Bureau of Statistics, by the FBI, by all these different federal agencies, and they're important for us as educators to understand first, so that way we can find ways to convey this into our subject matters, right? And then also being more wrongfully convicted. So according to the Oxford Dictionary, social justice is justice in terms of distribution of wealth, opportunities, and privileges within a society. So we'll break some of these things down. So wealth, pretty much you're talking about an abundance of valuable possessions of money, right? Because when we're talking about social justice, we have to understand what is even the definition of this first. And according to the dictionary, is broken down into these 3 different things. So wealth, an example of the social injustices of wealth is 25% of white homes are lower income compared to about 50% each in black and Hispanic homes. We have to also understand that as far as the overall U.S. population, there's a reason why black, brown communities are referred to as minority, right? Because in this country, not globally necessarily, but in this country, the Hispanic population is the second leadingest population between the black and Hispanic population, but at 15% of the overall U.S. population, and then the black community is about 13 to 15% as well. Of course, there's also issues in regards to like reporting and how you identify. That's its own conversation altogether, because that's some census stuff right there. But if we're talking about the leading majority in this country, we're talking about over 60% is white. If we're talking about the white overall net worth, basically it's 13 times greater than the black net worth, pretty much over 100,000 versus almost a little over 11,000. Like if you're taking the overall average, right? Then we're talking about 72% of white homes, white families own their homes, compared to 43% in the black community and 45% in the Hispanic community. If we're talking about opportunities, basically set of circumstances that makes it possible to even do these things, over 30% of people in the white community, 25 plus, own bachelor's degrees compared to 23% black and 15% Hispanic. 15% of high school graduates are black, but Princeton and Cornell University each have a black population of 8%, right? Unemployment was almost 4% in 2018, but 6.5% for the black population and 4.7% for the Hispanic population. And then if we're talking about privilege, pretty much this is a special right, advantage, or immunity granted, right? So again, this might look like being safer from police brutality, better closure rate on crime. When I teach criminal justice, I make clear, right, like the closure rate, like when a crime is, let's say let's say I'm a victim of a crime, I'm less likely to have, you know, my crime closed on or figured out than a white man in the suburbs. You know what I'm saying? And that number continues to drop, especially depending on the severity of the crime. So if you're talking about an assault, that has a better likelihood of getting resolved than, let's say, me being a victim of gun violence. And you know, gun violence victims in general, whether you're white or a person of color, it drops in general, but it drops even more significantly if you are Black or Hispanic. We're talking about gun violence victims. For the white population, the closure rate is about 50%, and then it drops to about 25% if you're Black and Hispanic. So it's, yeah.
Are you finding, and this is my experience, and I'm in San Antonio, Texas, I teach at a community college, and I try to bring lots of information to students, but are you finding that even among the minority population, Hispanics for me, it almost seems like as they move up, they lose sight of these statistics, and they almost buy into the narrative.
Yeah.
And it's like our own leaders are not even sharing this information. They're almost telling the opposite narrative. Like, yeah, it's if you want to, you can get there. It's up to you.
Yeah.
You know, like all these structural barriers.
Right.
Like it didn't happen to them in their mind. It did, but they didn't know that. No, where the people fought for their rights.
Right.
So it's like we're having to push against our own leaders.
Yeah.
You know, challenge them. You know, is that an experience you're having?
No, absolutely. That's definitely an excellent point. That's like honestly a very large question to answer,
Yeah,
because it's a lot of things we can get into that, you know, I'm gonna end up giving you answers that you probably wasn't even expecting. But what I'll say is, unfortunately, there's gatekeepers out here, right? That's just part of it. There's people that, you know, from your own community, just like what we talked earlier with hip hop, right? They come from the community. They coming from the community, but why are they being put in this position is because they're, you know, because if I'm from this community and I see somebody up there that looks like me, I'm more likely to listen to them. And what ends up happening is the labels know this, so now what they're gonna do is tell that person, say XYZ things to basically affect the population, and not necessarily in the most positive way, right? So unfortunately, you know, in politics, anybody could get bought, right? Anybody can, you know, cross over because it's better me than them. You know what I'm saying? It's like the same drug dealer mentality that people have on the corners. It's like, it's better you cop it from me than somebody that you can't even relate to. You know what I'm saying? And so people think that drugs are the only thing that can be sold as poison, but ideologies and ideas and, you know, access and things like that, that's another that's another form of it. So that's definitely an excellent point. Then of course, you know, a lot of us are still coming out of the colonial mindset. You know what I'm saying? Colonization, more than the physical aspect of bondage and slavery and things like that, was a mental slavery. You know, when you get into the Willie Lynch codes and all that type of stuff, you know, you're talking about breaking a person mentally, breaking them down so much mentally that it transfers from generation to generation. Like literally, something that happened over 200 years ago can still be present today. That's how powerful that application was, you know? So it's, as I tell my students, you're battling a lot of things at once. Many things, even things that I still to this day probably don't realize, a lot of things at once, you know, just even, and this is an example of like social justice conversations, redlining, right? And if you're in New York, yeah, yo, it's like you don't even realize it because it's not, nobody's screaming at you, you know, a derogatory term, but by separating you and segregating you and making you think that's your community, this is where you belong, this and that, like that cuts you off from so many things. In New York, if you live in the Bronx, if you live in Brooklyn, if you live, you know, in a, just any hood or whatever, to get to Manhattan, living already in New York can take you an hour plus.
Yes, that's why.
And I'm not mad at it, but but if you live in Manhattan, you could get anywhere in Manhattan just like that. Like you could get from 14th Street to 125th Street in Manhattan over 100 blocks in 15 minutes on the train. You know what I'm saying?
I was about to say, oh my God.
No, on the train, not driving.
If I make a comment just about what you said, I remember if this we started with apologies.
Yeah.
Oh, nice. So it's really weird, especially for our Latino population, because when you looked at back in the day, whenever Texas was taken, so back then, the reason that we identify as white is because either you were black or you were white, and Mexicans were neither. And so they're like, oh, we're not that, which is awful, and I'm not gonna say the words that I want to say about that.
Yeah.
But you should really read a book that's called "You Sound Like a White Girl" by Julissa Arce. She talks about it in that book. But I think that people lose sight of what it was because we do have different privileges. I'm brown, but I know that I'm white passing. I know that I went to a really good school. I know that I had these opportunities. And so for me to say to another brown person trying to do what I'm doing, oh, just do it. Just do it. Like,
I did it.
Yeah.
Okay, you can do it.
Yeah.
Okay,
and then I think that there's an area of resource guarding, like, okay, I can't have this piece of the pie if somebody else is going to try to come for it. Which is really gross because there's enough of the pie for everybody. There's so many opportunities, but I think that people get so honed in on that they lose sight of it, and then we're fucking over our own, like our own communities, which is sad.
Absolutely.
That's true. That's true.
I think part of it too is self-awareness and understanding how much of the, like you mentioned, the colonization, but how much we internalize the racism, the homophobia, and all the isms, right? And so when you think about like different cultures, even like in the black community, if you are not black American, you're other. You're a different kind of black, not the same kind of black as us. But if you are, let's say like Jonathan, you're not black, right? You're black, but you're not black.
Right.
But, or you may identify as black, but you're not black. And there's so much of that that's internalized in us and that we've taken on as our own. And that's getting into the colorism and everything. But again, it is historical. It goes back to like different countries paying to have white people come in and whiten the race and do all of these things. And so when we sit in the classroom, when we have our students talking about how their grandmothers made them pinch their noses or carry an umbrella so they won't get darker, or don't marry a black person or a brown person, or marry somebody white so your kids don't have a hard time. All of that stuff is, and then not even to mention what we see in the media, if we internalize it, and then I think it's to a point where sometimes we don't even realize that we've adopted it as our own ideas and ideals.
That was right on the money.
Well, I was just thinking, I'm from, I teach in Yuma, Arizona, right on the border, and also in Calexico, California. And the majority of our students go into criminal justice.
Yeah.
Well, at least a third. So they go into the border patrol, they go into policing, and about 75 to 80% of our students are Mexican American, and then there is this shift, right? So they become kind of the policers, and it is this kind of shift, like you were saying. It's all of a sudden they go from they become like hardened, and it's like us versus them, and it's really hard to see because you see it happen sometimes in the classroom where it's like, where do they get this attitude?
Well, do you mind for what's so insidious about it, and I'm in the classroom, is that, in San Antonio, the board is minority, the administration is very minority. So I feel like I should have the opportunity to do what I need to do in the classroom. But the policies and the procedures that are being put in place are there. It's like, I think they catch you in the classroom.
Yeah.
If you go too far, students will report you for it, and there are policies in place that keep you from teaching out what they would consider outside of what you're supposed to be teaching.
Yeah.
So, like she said, awareness, there is that lack of awareness or lack of a will to support those who are aware and are trying to continue this progression,
Right. Yeah.
they're like just blocking.
Again, this is just like anything else we've talked about already up to this point. This is all part of the system, right? It's all a systemic thing. We can't look at all these things as being separate, like criminal justice, education, health, entertainment, whatever it is. We can't look at them as being separate entities. They're all just limbs of the same body, right? They all operate under the same function, which is, to promote a certain type of mentality, you know what I'm saying? And again, as mentioned earlier, there's unfortunately what you would call gatekeepers, people that are there to basically keep this specific thought in progression. Even if somebody can come in to basically, I don't want to say snap people out of it, but that can create awareness about some of these things, that person is going to get the most penalized, because now you're going against what we're doing. You know what I'm saying? You're being anti-establishment, because the establishment, it got its reasons for why it wants to promote these things, you know what I'm saying, and keep people in these types of mental bondages or what have you, because again, a lot of it, as we showed earlier, we can go as far back as slavery, and some of those elements and aspects are still present today. Again, with privileges, we're also talking about black students are 3 times more likely than white students to get disciplined in school, which is known as the school to prison pipeline, right? And just even on that point, if you are disciplined, like expelled, suspended in a high school setting, within a year you are more likely to actually end up in the criminal justice system as well. And my question is, why does this even matter? Why should I even care for this topic? Martin Luther King said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. It's like what we're seeing overseas right now. Some people might be saying, like, what's it matter? It's not even happening in your own turf. But the thing is, a lot of US dollars are being spent overseas, so it's like, it kind of is your business. But at the same time, it's like, those things, those elements of what's happening elsewhere, somehow, some way make their way over here anyways, right? Especially since we are a nation that, is very diverse in different ways. We have all types of populations, so it's important to take injustice anywhere as a serious threat. So again, why does this matter? Example. So it's kind of like the butterfly effect, right? So for example, in New York, the Department of Health said 1 in 5 people in New York show symptoms of mental health disorder. I actually think is even tighter, the statistic. I would say like 1 out of every 1, right? I'm speaking as a New Yorker, so I know one thing or two about, what that do to you. But okay, let's start off with mental health, what have you. Let's just say depression, right? Let's start off with depression or something like that. That depression can eventually lead to violence, right? You might think it can't, but maybe you get fed up one day and just explode, boom, there's violence, maybe there's marital issues. Depression can lead to insecurities, which might mean attention seeking and leads to teen pregnancy. There's many different aspects it could get into, ultimately maybe even suicide. Then from there it could transition into basically this statistic right here, half of all lifetime cases begin by age 14, 3/4 begin by age 24, and then from there it generates a over $200 billion loss in earnings nationwide. So basically that's over $200 billion that are lost because people's mental health is not being tackled, right? So this is an example of how one thing leads to the next, leads to the next, leads to the next, right? So again, mental health can lead to poor school performance. It could, not being good in school might mean you drop out. You might resort to violence to get by, and then that violence, it might have started off with, I'm selling drugs, whatever, and I gotta be violent to protect my turf. To then one day I take it too far. Now that's a homicide. Now that's a person that's not here no more. Now that's 2 people not here no more because I'm gonna be locked up for the rest of my life, right? Again, this is what I showed you earlier, or what I was talking about earlier as far as closure rates. And this is coming from FBI statistics as of 2016. But the black lines are basically non-firearm victims. The dotted line is the white population. The solid line is black and Hispanic population. So again, if you're a non-firearm victim, your statistics of your case being closed are a lot higher. If you're a white victim, your closure rate's at 80%. If you're Black and Hispanic, it's about 72. I don't even know if that's all the way accurate, but we'll just go with it. But as far as the shooting rates, if you're a victim of a shooting, right, of a firearm, in general, those numbers drop. So the white population is about 67%, and then my bad, I lowballed it a little too much earlier. I guess I confused it with some stats, but the Black and Hispanic population is at just under 50%, at 42%. And so these are some injustices that if you have, especially Black Hispanic students in your classroom, you have to be aware of, because they're coming into your classroom with this trauma, whether they know it or not, right? The environment plays a huge role in it, and some of us that came out, let's just say, good in life, well off in life, we have to think, because it's been proven that the most important years of your life are the first 5 years, right? Because those first 5 years, unless you're some kind of super child or something like that, don't nobody remember the first 5 years of their life, barely, right? And the reality is that based on who your parents were and who was in your life in the first 5 years, whether you know it or not, that programming that you have from the first 5 years follow you for the rest of your life. Now, there's things that after that you might learn, and maybe you can unlearn and relearn or what have you, but there's certain aspects of the first 5 years that it is what it is. It's already locked in, it's fixed, right? Unless you continue to do the work and continue to dive and dig deep and find out what those things are, you know what I'm saying? Them first 5 years make a difference. So if you come from an environment where you didn't necessarily have both parents, maybe because they was working all the time, or mass incarceration, or whatever the case may be, that's going to affect your overall function, right? And one thing I always say is, don't ever think it can't happen to you. So maybe not in regards to that, but in regards to anything in general. Education is key. So for example, back in the day, reading was illegal if you were considered a slave. And the reason why I bring this up is because Huey P., as I mentioned earlier, he was illiterate going into his final year of high school, right? So this is to give you an idea of how important education is. He was illiterate going into high school, was told he was not college material, continually got in trouble with the law, was told he had an IQ of 74, and he eventually taught himself how to read. Eventually, once he got matriculated into a college, he got his associate's degree at Merritt College, studied law at Oakland City College, and earned a bachelor's degree, and then got a PhD in social philosophy. Huey P. Newton is basically the co-founder of the Black Panther Party, right? And while he was involved in college, he got involved with different organizations, became part of Phi Beta Sigma, the African American Association. He instituted the first Black history course at his college. He attended Malcolm X's speeches, and he re-envisioned a different set of education systems. And of course, as being the co-founder for the Black Panther Party, he helped create the 10-point program, which pretty much helped provide free breakfast to school children. They did clothes and shoe drives and outlets and things like that, and eventually instituted a elementary school. And they created a whole program for programs like his, such as the COINTELPRO, the Counterintelligence program, which pretty much spied on what they considered Black militant organizations and things like that to get intel on them. And if we look at other revolutionaries, they all have one thing in common, which is education, right? Martin Luther King, there's a reason why there's a doctor in front of his name, right? He got his PhD in theology from Boston University. Stokely Carmichael, he got his bachelor's in philosophy at Howard University. Marcus Garvey, he studied law and philosophy in London. Angela Davis had her PhD. Gandhi ended up studying law, and of course President Nelson Mandela, he studied law as well in Johannesburg. So these are some great revolutionary leaders, great names that we see attached with conversations around social justice and things like that, and we see that education played a role in that. So now that we have an understanding, here are some actionable items, how to implement social justice in the classroom. Number one, community. We have to make students feel and believe it is a safe space for dialogue, which I'm sure most of us already do that, if not all of us. But pretty much the first thing is establishing absolutes. What is intolerable in the classroom? As Amala said earlier, all the isms, racism, sexism, homophobia, all of this is no questions asked. This is not something that you should accept ever in the classroom, and everybody has to understand that, right? Having impartiality towards grading and things like that, you know, making sure that the students know, hey, you know, if you have an issue with your grade, like, you're more than welcome to have that conversation with me, not making it seem like it's a one and done deal. Students will have all types of views. So, you know, one thing that we have to understand is that their views are reflective of themselves and their environments, right? But we should still, as long as it's not disrespectful or demeaning in any way, we should still have a openness to these views, because that's the world that they come from, and basically allow for disagreement to happen in the classroom space. We don't want the classroom to be a perfect utopia either, because it's not preparing them for life, right? Because life isn't like that, especially if you in the tri-state area. Somebody gonna remind you real quick that this ain't heaven, bro. You know, so you're gonna have to kind of give them a little bit of a leeway to disagree and go back and forth, again, as long as it's not disrespectful. So kind of creating that culture where it's okay for us to talk about most things, but not get disrespectful, obviously. Then from there, you establish rapport. This is where your presence supersedes your knowledge. So part of building that rapport is learning students' names. Listen, from the first class all the way to the last class, I tell these students, again, for the purpose of the class, you know, before you share your thought, please remind us your name. I might look annoying, I might look like I don't know the names, and I ain't gonna lie, sometimes I still don't remember the name. You got like over 100 students in this semester, come on, like, let's be real. But at the same time, it does help everybody else get to know each other as well. So, because my job as an educator is not only for me to educate the students, but for the students to also educate the students, you know, for them to build that camaraderie. So learn their names, extend your services. So obviously office hours before, after class. If that doesn't work for you, you know, here are my office hours, et cetera, et cetera. You know, be authentic. Yesterday I pulled up, you know what I'm saying, with my vest, whatever, you know what I'm saying. I'm not saying you gotta pull up like that to the classroom, but whoever you authentically are, don't be afraid to let that show in the classroom to whatever extent, right? Obviously, maintain boundaries, but allow the students to see that you're also a human and that you're not always in this, you know, professionalism type of mode all the time. You know, and part of how you be authentic is incorporating personal interests of yours. So I rap, for example, so I included hip hop in my classrooms because I also rap. So you know, on different classroom occasions, I rap for my students and they can see, wow, like this dude is showing who he really is, you know what I'm saying? So that's definitely helpful. Lead through consistency, so basically be unchanging in your efforts. Hard work beats talent when the talent don't work hard, so you gotta just show up like that every single day. Then from there, you go into orientation, the art of learning and how to learn, right? This is one thing that doesn't get talked about enough in conferences, I think, is the art of learning how to learn, right? Learning is a skill in itself. Like, you gotta teach people how to learn, right? I can teach somebody to learn through feel, through smell, through hearing, through visualization. There's so many different ways I can teach someone how to learn, but what is the best way that works for you, right? Learning is not a science, right? You might want to look at these different aspects that I just mentioned, the visual, artistic, all that stuff. You might also want to include guest speakers. You might want to include a film or two in your sessions, in your lectures or what have you. Then after that, you know, you want to follow up, make sure that the students are understanding the concepts, reinforce what's already been established, and establish key markers. So if I'm teaching a criminal justice class, I know for sure I need the students to know specific numbers and specific points throughout the semester. The statistic on this is that students are generally going to retain about 5 to 10% of what they learn in the whole semester, right? So if you're going to learn anything or remember anything, I need you to remember these specific points. There's 2 million people that are locked up on any given day, right? There's over 4 million people on parole and probation any single day, right? So kind of giving them the key markers so that from one class to the next, to the next, to the next, I can continue to create these connections and allow the themes of every class to remain consistent. Then from there, we get into the scholarship, don't miss the forest for the trees, right? So before we get into these quote unquote woke dialogues, conversations where it gets real in depth and philosophical, you know, you still want to set the tone with the syllabus, the course overview, just certain foundational things that help establish all the other things that you're going to get into. Continue to establish those markers, so those statistics, those main points you want students to leave with, and empower your students to do their assignments. So, you know, allow for assignments to be fun and creative. Maybe you want them to, you know, do a reflection on something they saw on Instagram, let's just say, you know what I'm saying? Find me something on Instagram that deals with social justice as far as, you know, that you think is a mathematical problem or you think is a science problem or what have you. And however you want to phrase that is totally up to you. But you want it to be fun and creative because that's the only way these, you know, a lot of these students are going to want to learn, if it's fun, if it's creative. Create assignments that are of interest to your students. Ask them, what are things that y'all would like to do in the semester? You know what I'm saying? They're the direct source. They're the ones that can tell you directly like what they would like to see and what can continually be improved upon. You know, and allow for opportunities to form autonomy without risking their grade or what have you. So if you have 10 reflections in the semester, you know, maybe one of those reflections, you let them pick a topic that they want to do the reflection on, you know, and let them know this is kind of like, you know, a giveaway in a sense, like I'm not going to penalize you for nothing with this specific thing, but this is an assignment that you could potentially think about what you want to do. Another thing that you can consider is open educational resources, so zero cost curriculum. A lot of students can't afford textbooks, right? So part of OER is developing a syllabus from scratch yourself. This might be a summer project, this might be a winter project, but whatever it is, this is something that helps build a lot of rapport with the students. You save them at least $100 to $200 a semester, right? Because in criminal justice, a book can go for that much. And at the same time, it just makes it a lot easier for yourself because if you ever wanted to re-edit anything or revise anything, you could just switch those links out and put different information or what have you. You know, test taking versus other assignments. Test taking that has its own racial history altogether. Basically, it's something that has to be considered as far as, is it optimal for me to give a test versus to give a open-ended assignment to the students, right? What's more inclusive, and then, you know, pretty much go from there. So what I want to do is kind of show you some examples of assignments that I've had students do. So I'll have students do presentations and I tell them summarize a final paper for me in 5-7 minutes, you know what I'm saying, through a presentation. Students have literally done Jeopardy games for me. So they'll create a Jeopardy chart, they'll click, you know, they'll create the topics and then the different point systems. So let's say we click punishment for 400. The question is going to be name 5 individuals who served 10+ years for rape, attempted murder, and attempted murder, but were all found innocent. And you got the Central Park 5. And this is directly a student's assignment right here. Another question would be name the individual who did not have a speedy trial and was kept 3 years in Rikers Island to be found innocent. Khalif, right? Again, you could use social media as an example. If you're a math professor, for example, maybe create a word prompt. You know, look up the hashtag. At that time, it was George Floyd, and see how many hashtags pop up for that name, or the top hashtag, and then do an equation to, you know, differentiate that between the term social justice, and then kind of go from there. That's just one of many different creative ways to get into it. So I know we're pretty much at the time.